All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over some housekeeping items. Everyone will be on mute. If you have any questions you'd like answered, please submit them through the Q&A chat, which will be at the bottom of your screen. Please note we have a limited time, so we might not be able to get to all of the questions submitted. If you run into any technical questions during the presentation, technical problems during the presentation, you may reach out through the chat function also at the bottom of your screen, and myself or Shayna will connect with you and try and figure out what's going on. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, time to introduce you to our topic for the day. Break down the communication barriers, leadership through effective communication. Leadership through effective communication is essential for any organization. It is always important, but is particularly crucial during a crisis. This session will guide participants how to lead through effective communication. It will also provide recommendations on how to effectively use virtual communication tools such as Zoom and MS Teams to maintain important internal and external relationships. Today, we are joined by Dr. Darren Francis from KPU. Dr. Darren Francis is an experienced educator and post-secondary administration, having worked at 4 different universities throughout his career. He started his career in academic advising, supporting students with their academic and career plans before moving to post-secondary administration, where he's worked in a variety of leadership roles. Currently, Darren is the chair of Applied Communications Department at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. Dr. Francis, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm looking forward to giving this webinar. I must confess, this is my first webinar in this format, so I'm looking forward to having a great afternoon or a great hour of lunch here. Just some additional housekeeping. We do have a poll, and I'll highlight the poll in a couple slides from now, where you get an opportunity to give some feedback. For all other questions, we're going to hold those questions. You're going to send them through the question and answer tab, and Liz is going to read them to me, and then I'll respond at the end of the session. Just because we have the everyone's muted, so we think that's the best format. So with that being said, let's launch into the webinar here. So what do we have in front of us today? So we're going to talk about an overview of personal and organizational communication. We're going to talk about organizational leadership through effective communication. Then we're going to talk about the impact of a crisis on organizational communication. I'm really excited to be joined by a special guest, Dean Stephanie Howes. She'll join us a little later in the presentation. We'll do a little summary of what we've accomplished here in our 45 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you for your audience questions. With that being said, we'll jump into it. So what I wanted to start with, I wanted to start to make sure that we were on the same page. So I want to talk about personal communication and organizational communication. So I have a couple definitions for us. Personal communication is the type of interaction that you might have with a person that you're fairly acquainted with, such as a friend or a colleague or even a relative. We're going to be primarily focusing on organizational communication, which is the sending and receiving of messages among an interrelated group of individuals with a particular environment or setting to achieve an individual or common goal. So this is in our example, like KPU would be an organizational, that would need to have organizational communication. And that's kind of the platform that we're going to be working with. As you are all business leaders, we're going to be talking about how do we effectively communicate within that organizational context. So with that being said, I think we're gonna, Liz, if you can send out that poll. We've got 3, it's not an exhaustive list, we've got 3 kind of responses for you. But what is the most difficult aspect of organizational communication? Is it the distance between communicators? Is it managing the communication medium, or the number of people to contact? So feel free to, and if you have another option that you feel that you're challenged by, feel free to hit the other button, and then we'll get the results here. So. I'm not allowed to vote. So as you collect that information, I'm looking forward to seeing what your general feelings are, because this will also guide our discussion as we move through the rest of the presentation. Just waiting on the results now. Okay, so managing the communication medium. Yeah, so that's a real challenge. So for those of you that responded, that looks like the one with the most votes. And I can see why that's a real challenge, particularly for those of us that have been kind of thrust into a situation where using a different medium here. So for example, MS Teams, Zoom, Skype, for those of us that were unfamiliar with that, that could be a situation where like that's something that's really challenging and really difficult for us to manage, particularly when you're thinking about the size of an organization and the fact that a lot of our audience members don't understand those platforms as well. So yeah, I can totally identify why that's been identified as being a key aspect to one of the challenges here. So what I want to talk about is when you're communicating organizational context, one of the things we can do is we can have a plan. And so one of the things I talk about in my classes is the SMART framework. So what SMART stands for is the situation, what is causing you to need to communicate, the message, what is it that you want to say, the audience, who is your audience? Like, who are you trying to communicate with? Is it everyone in your organization, or is it just a small group? Or if it's a small group, are there other members of your organization that may also want that information as well? And then you want to think about the response. And this is really particularly important. You want to make sure that you think through what you want your audience to do. So it's on our minds. We're all affected by it. This is a great example with COVID. When you're looking at the SMART framework in relation to COVID, one of the things that we look at is what is it that we wanted our audience to do, or the provincial leaders, provincial officials, what is it they wanted us to do as an audience? They wanted the audience to stay indoors, right? Self-isolate and social distance. And that's what you want. And they want to be really clear about that. And if you have a plan and you articulate that message and you give some context to why it's so important, then you can deliver that message and then have your audience respond the way you want them to. And then finally, the tool. How are we going to send out the message? So, you know, in my class example, I talk about needing to cancel class in relation to like a snowstorm or inclement weather. One of the things I suggest to the students is, would I phone every individual student? If I have 100 students across 4 classes, would I call every one of those students individually? No, that wouldn't be realistic. And then we talk through, and we have our platform where our classes are all online, and that's where through Moodle we can communicate effectively and send messages to classes and targeted messages and get responses back to make sure that they are going to follow the response. And in that case, you know, I wouldn't want them to come to class because class has been canceled because of the snowstorm. So that's kind of what we're looking for from that, having a plan and communicating effectively within an organizational context. So this is going to kind of guide us through the rest of our conversation. So once again, you know, we've got our personal communication, we've got our organizational definitions. Now I want to talk about what is leadership. And I have a simple definition here, and I know we could talk probably for the rest of the afternoon about what truly is leadership. But I wanted to have just a simple definition to help us work through our 45 minutes together here. So leadership is the art of moving a group of people to act toward achieving a common goal. So this is what's challenging about leadership. When you're working with other people, your decisions are impacting others, and they have their own ideas and their own goals and motives. And so what we're trying to do as leaders is create a framework and a relationship where we can communicate with our team members effectively so that they will understand why they're making certain choices and why they have to choose certain types of actions in relation to COVID. Why is it that we are social distancing? That's one of the things as a leader we have to kind of communicate and try to get that message across so people will want to follow. So for those of you that haven't heard of Coos and Posner, they have an excellent set of books and done all kinds of research about leadership. And for them, leadership really comes around relationship building. So I've taken some of their observations here. The first one there is the best way to lead people into the future is to connect with them deeply in the present. And this is where you're starting to build that relationship. And there's nothing more demoralizing than a leader who can't clearly articulate why we're doing what we're doing. So this is one of those things where you build that relationship, and then as a leader, and you use that SMART framework that we talked about, where they can clearly articulate what we're doing. We talk about the situation, we talk about the message, and then we know who we're communicating with, and then we have that very specific response that we're looking for tied with the tool. How are we going to communicate effectively? Sometimes a personal presentation in front of 30, 40 people makes a lot of sense. Obviously, in the COVID environment, it's using tools such as Zoom or MS Teams to try to communicate more effectively. Then the last observation that they have is when people see a leader doing what you say, then they have the evidence that you mean it. Otherwise, it's just words. Your actions send the loudest signals about what other people should be doing. So this is where you're creating that corporate culture where people feel that the leader is someone that they can trust and believe in. And so those are some key observations that Coos and Posner have made in relation to leadership in that organizational context. So leadership and effective communication. Leadership and effective communication are closely linked. The more effective you can communicate, the more your leadership skills can come out. So in my classes, I talk about, particularly on the first day, that I talk about how important communication is. And we always talk about, and I talk about discipline bias, where, if you're an accountant by nature, that you feel that's the most important discipline. If you're an economist, you feel that's the most important discipline. And what I like to say is that it doesn't matter how good you are at those specific skills. If you can't communicate it effectively, no one's going to really know that. And so that's one of those things around leadership. Oftentimes, when you ask what makes an effective leader, it's that ability to connect with others. And so one of the ways you do that is through effective communication. And so as we move through the presentation here, one of the important skills, and in my mind, the most important skill, both as a communicator and a leader, is listening. Good communicators are also good listeners. When you listen well, you gain a clear understanding of another's perspective and knowledge. Now, I'll give you a really easy example. When you talk about being an active listener and being dedicated and committed to listening to someone, that I don't mean this, right? For those of you who can see my phone, yeah. We've all been in that situation. I know I've been in that situation where you're trying to communicate with someone and they're clearly distracted by their phone or they're distracted by something else. And one of the things that I would advocate for, and if you can take, and one of the things I want you to take away from our session today is make sure when you are in a leadership position or just in general, if you're in a position where you need to listen to someone, make sure that you give them your full attention, because it really makes the person feel heard and valued. And that's an important aspect of connecting both as a communicator and a leader. And then the other thing is be authentic, right? Don't try to be someone you're not. That's one of the mistakes I know I made personally when I first got into a leadership role. I was a little bit younger than some of the people that were reporting to me, and I felt like I had to be a certain way to meet their expectations. And what I learned over time was not being authentic and not being to myself, and committed to my own kind of sense of self. Um, I wasn't really connecting with them. And then over time, as they realized that I was trying to do a good job, I built a relationship with them, that authenticity really made a difference. So being honest, sincere, and finding your own voice and own words to communicate is really, really important. And that's that combination around that listening and then being authentic in your communication. And then finally, I've got visibility. You want to be visible when you're in a leadership context, particularly when you're communicating. So if you want to communicate well, don't be out of sight. Don't be known for only sending your emails and official missives. So this is when you only interaction with your boss is when they send these really long emails about telling you what you should do or shouldn't do for that matter. And so this is where you being visible can really make a significant difference in how you build that relationship with your team and other members of your organization. People need to see and feel who you are to feel connected to the work you want them to do. Finding ways to interact with all of your stakeholder groups. So this is where they can find meaning in their work by having a better relationship with you. And that's that being visible. And it ties, again, they all link together. If you're a strong listener, you're visible, and then you're authentic, then that ties together. And what it does is it builds trust. And this is so important in an environment when you're leading, because you need that trust so people understand that you have their best interest at heart. And this is one of those real challenges. And what it does is when you have this trust, and it goes both ways, they trust you and you trust them, it allows you to do things that push through the emotion. Sometimes in a workplace context, right, people get really upset, particularly in crisis. And so when they come in and they're really emotional, you can kind of push through the noise of the emotion and get to really what's bothering them, right? And so when you do that, you can build up that trust and say, look at, Sally or Stephen, they don't often get upset that like this. So, what's really going on? And you can kind of push through that noise and then really listen to what they're saying, and it can make a difference. In my own personal context, once upon a time when I was at another university, an administrative role, a woman came in and she was really upset. The long and short of it was that her daughter had applied to the university I was working on at the time, and I was responsible for the registrar's office where those letters were generated. And she was really upset that her daughter didn't get a letter. And then she was, really, really critical of our processes and some other things. And, my reaction was like, you get a bit defensive. But what I tried to do, and I pushed through my own emotion and I pushed through her emotion, and I thought, what's really going on here? Why is she so upset? Long and short, I went and looked into it. I asked some members of my team that were responsible for that function. And it turned out we had set an automatic trigger, an electronic trigger, so that when we made a decision code to say you're accepted to the university, an email would be automatically sent, followed by a formal letter. It turned out that functionality wasn't working. And because I was able to push through my own emotion and kind of trust the colleague of mine, we were able to kind of get to a place where she actually saved a significant number of mistakes being made where we weren't sending these letters out. It turned out we probably identified the error within about 48 hours, where if I hadn't listened to her, who knows how long it would have gone on, because we didn't have that kind of information. So that's an example where, I was able to listen. I was trying to push through the emotion of the situation, and then I was visible because I was approachable from a perspective of being in a leadership role, and then ultimately the trust, right? The collegial trust that you create in a relationship, where you can think, well, she's not usually that upset, so let's push through and see what's really going on here, and it worked out for the benefit of everyone in the end. So the impact of a crisis on organizational communication. Bad news travels much faster than good news. And so this is something you have to be mindful of when you're communicating in an organization, particularly a larger organization. And what's even worse than bad news traveling much faster than good news is, in the absence of good or bad news, people will create news. And they will create rumors, and they will create different scenarios around what is happening to justify and explain the situation. And so when you're doing that, you're looking at it from that perspective, you want to make sure as a leader, and we tie it all back, right? We create our plan with the SMART framework. We look at it from the perspective of making sure we're being authentic. We make sure we listen to our team. We make sure that we're visible, and we can fill in that gap so that our audience, our stakeholders, will not create news or push through on only sending out bad messaging, right? Because as I said, the bad messages tend to travel much faster than good news. So if you can fill that gap and have a lot of communication, you can address both any issues around bad news, and like have a plan in place, and then follow that up from the perspective of not allowing people to make up information because there is no information. And so that's where it's really, really important. And so what can we do as leaders? We can listen. We can develop a plan. And the reason I have listened before developing a plan is I think it's really important that we give our stakeholders and our colleagues and our leadership team, we hear from them so that we understand their perspectives, because it can help inform our plan. Our plan can be more effective because we'll have a better understanding of our audience. We will know specifically what they're looking for. And that allows us from that perspective to be in a situation where we fill in that plan around the needs of our audience, which is really important. Then we can be authentic, right? It's easy to be true to ourselves in this kind of context, right? Whether it's a crisis or everyday communication. If we're true to ourselves and we do what we feel is best, it's hard to be criticized for that. And so when you're authentic, people will appreciate it. They may not necessarily agree with the decisions that are being made, right? That's one of the challenges, and one I struggled with a lot when I first got into leadership positions, is not every decision I make people will love, right? When your decisions impact others, they won't always necessarily agree with the decision, but you want them to respect it. And that's where that relationship and that trust is so important, because it allows that opportunity for you over time to build a really strong relationship where they may not agree with your decision, but they respect the decision, which is really important as a leader. And then finally, be visible, right? So if there's a crisis, or even in everyday communication, if there's something going on and you're not visible, that is not a good thing. And this is something that you can take advantage of. And it's something that can really make a difference when people see the leader taking, not necessarily in front stage, but just being available to communicate and effectively deliver messages so that people aren't feeling they're not being supported. And that's a really important aspect of this. So a great example, in my opinion, of this approach that we've talked about is Dr. Bonnie Henry. She's been extremely visible. She's been authentic to herself. She has had a plan in place. Now, it's not that the plan hasn't changed. We're just embarking just on some changes where the restrictions are being removed. But what's really important about Dr. Bonnie Henry is that she established the plan and she moved forward with that plan all the way through. And so she never said restrictions are going to be off next week. She never said restrictions are going to be off 2 weeks from now. What she did is she was very cautious about her messaging all the way through. And then as the data supported, which is in our case, the flattening of the curve in BC, then she changed her message, right? She looked at the SMART framework, the situation had changed, And then she delivered a new message, which is restrictions can be lifted, small gatherings. We experienced this very specifically myself on Mother's Day, as my mom's in a long-term care facility, and we were not able to see her for several weeks. Fortunately, she's safe, and we understood the guidelines. They were communicated very effectively by the resident care facility, and then obviously at a larger, from a provincial level. And so we didn't love that we weren't able to see my mom, but the idea is that we respected why we couldn't see her. And then on Mother's Day, we were able to have a social distance visit from about 8 feet or so. So that's where you see that progression. As the situation changes, your messaging can change. And then the response you want from your audience can change as well. And in my opinion, Dr. Bonnie Henry's done a remarkable job. And some credit does go to the Premier as well, as he's deferred a lot of deferred to her expertise on guiding BC through this, where not all politicians have. So he deferred to the expert and then followed those guidelines. And then once she saw that the data supported that we could relinquish some of these restrictions, then the government kind of stepped in and kind of made some more public statements around it. But for the most part, Dr. Bonnie Henry has been front and center and having her daily press conferences, which again fills that gap, make sure she's visible, and there's no kind of making up numbers as she's presenting the numbers every single day. So I think she was a great example. And this segues to our special guest, Dean Stephanie Howes. She is going to come in and kind of give a KPU context to our environment, particularly around COVID. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a question to her to get us started and allow her to go from there. So Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone.
Just when COVID first kind of came in and we started seeing all the changes that were going to be required, when did you and the School of Business leadership team realize that frequent virtual meetings were needed?
I would say right away. Literally right away. The context for myself, I was away out of the country when this started to really start to ramp up. So I got home and checked my email, and my inbox was extraordinarily full. And it was apparent to me right away that with the number of questions that were coming, that there wasn't a consistent message going out with the information to essentially settle people in knowing that where they work had this under control. Because there was a bit of messiness at the beginning and that this was now a public health emergency, it was a pandemic, and as well as what does that mean for institutions such as a university. And then, as Darren was explaining earlier in the presentation, that's when the rumors started and different stories started to fill in. People were filling the gaps with their own imagination and their speculations. And so I started to see an actual within my inbox, the gradual sort of panic starting to rise in the emotionality in some of the questions and the emails. So to me, as Dean of the School of Business, I knew right away I needed to get responses out. So I use the SMART way of doing my communications as well, sort of finding out what the situation is about. So for me, it was finding out where we're at in British Columbia regarding COVID-19, what exactly is happening, making sure I had my facts in order. And then the situation from a leader's point of view was, how does that apply to the group of people that I lead within the bigger institution? And then it was about messaging. So it needed to be messaging to a grand scale, because I have about almost 300 people that are sort of a direct report. And then we have about 7,500 students that we have to think about as well in the School of Business, who were all in classes at face-to-face at this time. And so I needed a grand message for everybody. And then I took it upon myself to have those messages that are one-on-one. So it was phone calls, email. If we needed to meet on MS Teams, I was willing to meet with people on an individual basis. One of the things that I've learned as a leader, that there can be sort of the common questions that you can answer to a large group, or even just to, say, 10 people. But there's always those questions that are sort of underpinning, that have more of an individual need to be answered. So when you're building trust and you're building the relationships as a leader, the communication also means you have to understand when you need to make it a large, grand announcement versus maybe you need some special individual attention to be had. Because, and I'm sure all of you out there being leaders, you know that if you don't get to the one person that has what I usually call a very unique and talented imagination, where they fill in the gaps very quickly with information that is not accurate, then the bad news piece that Darren was talking about, that travels much faster, adds to the work of a leader trying to bring back the message that is based in fact and evidence, and has the sort of practical way for a group of people to move forward. You want to get to those people first. And so sometimes that means some individual attention. So I found myself, in the context of COVID, I found myself staying up to almost 3, 4 in the morning every day, answering emails, so that people felt that their questions were being heard, 2, that they were being addressed, and 3, leadership was on it. Darren mentioned something about the emotionality, getting past it. And I think in a situation like this, which is very new to any leader dealing with a pandemic, I didn't learn that in school, by the way, necessarily on how to deal in the School of Business as a dean with a pandemic. But it's the same as any other crisis that can happen. And it can be a crisis from one human being to a crisis of a department to a crisis of a school. That you need to be present. And in that way was to respond quickly, succinctly, and kindly. So one of the pieces where I understand my audience is compassion goes a long way. So rather than getting defensive or having a response that doesn't necessarily sound caring, it just doesn't take you anywhere as a leader. It doesn't build trust with the people that you're leading. So it was very important to me to show compassion, especially when we've got a situation where that it's more than just the workplace. It's you're worried about your family, you're worried about your home life, your parents, and as Darren said, and mothers and fathers in long-term care facilities. So my response was always quick, it was compassionate, and it was based in fact and evidence. And the tools that I've been using are email, MS Teams. I am now just embarking on figuring out how to send videos instead of email messages. That I've yet to master that, but I am working on it. Again, none of my messaging is perfect. As leaders, we can't be perfect, but I think from that visibility piece, I think it's important for videos, especially with our students. So I think the biggest piece is setting your own expectations, but then also setting expectations with those that you're communicating with. That I couldn't keep the 3, 4 in the morning emailing up for very long. It's not sustainable, it's not realistic. So I started to then set expectations that we would be communicating with the entire School of Business every week. Then we would meet with the chairs of the departments, and we have a weekly meeting. We normally only meet once a month, but now we meet once a week. My own leadership team, we usually only meet every other week. Now we're meeting every week. And we're doing this all on MS Teams so that we can see each other, so that the facial expressions, so that there's at least some sort of more human connection, rather than just emails and telephone and phone calls. Ultimately, the door is always open for questions. So if people feel that they can contact their leader and Their questions, no matter what they are, will be answered, and respectfully and compassionately. I must admit that reduced all the questions. So when people are feeling stressed, they don't trust their leadership, they don't feel that someone is at the wheel, you will find that you will get more questions, more emotionality, and probably more of that bad news travels faster than if you just front load all of your work when it comes to as a leader. You'll find that the workload will go down, and you will find that when you do message, that it's much more productive. It's much more ending in less questions, because people are feeling secure that things are being taken care of. And so they can worry about the things that are outside of their workplace, such as their family and situation at home. I must say, I'm not particularly excited about the idea of working from home for months and months. So it's always remembering the context of people, of what they're living at that moment. Be very careful in your wording. So that's been my experience. It's more visibility, more communication, remember your audience, keep the compassionate high, and when the situation changes, update people right away. Don't let there be a space for imagination to be filling it in.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll just piggyback to say, as chair of one of the departments where we went to weekly meetings, the visibility of you and the leadership team was really effective, particularly for some of our colleagues that were clearly, just you could tell by the nature of their questions, were really struggling with the known unknown, which is, how long is this going to last? When is this going to end? You know, what does this mean to the school business? What does this mean to summer enrollments? What does this mean to fall enrollments? Not all of the questions were fair in the sense that there's no possible way you could have predicted those answers. But yet you took the time to say, "We'll look into it." You know, you were authentic. In my humble opinion, you were authentic to yourself, and we'll look into it. We'll get back to you about that. We're hoping the data will support enrollment numbers. And then one of the things Stephanie did after that was she started sending me enrollment numbers so that everyone was on the same page to be able to know, okay, things are going to be okay. You know, the students adapted, in my opinion, to the online environment pretty smoothly, really, based on enrollments. And so for those of you in the audience, what we're talking about with enrollments is just like, how many students are actually going to take classes in the summer? We just didn't know. We didn't know people, even though we were offering a remote virtual environment, we didn't know if that was going to be something that people were going to be interested in. But based on the data, it looks like it is. So thanks so much for commenting, Stephanie.
I think one last thing.
Yeah, sure.
And I need to just, this is probably something the leaders that are with us today will understand. One of the things that is that listening part, you know, not being distracted by having your phone, and you can hear, and this is one of the challenges that I had. I could hear my computer going ding, 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 with all these emails coming through. And then when you're on these tools, such as MS Teams, which we use a lot at KPU, your emails come at the bottom of the screen. So you're listening to your team, and then you see all these emails popping up. Some are saying time sensitive, emergency, urgent, and you're finding yourself looking away from your audience, and you can feel your brain shifting to what's happening now. My biggest piece of advice is turn off your email. Don't have the distract, put your phones away, because what I have found, when you do actually listen, you're going to drill down to the actual question that's happening, that's at the table. And you're not going to be addressing things that actually are quite irrelevant for you as a leader. You have your goals, you have your strategic sort of avenues, and then you have some people to answer to, depending on what your role is there's others that have expectations on you. So you need to just compartmentalize at times. And I think when it comes to communication as a leader, I think your time management is of the utmost importance. Because if you find yourself listening more than you are doing, or that you are messaging more than you're listening, and you're finding yourself maybe opening the door too wide, and you're not being careful in how you're managing your time, you'll find yourself sort of rolling out of control when it comes to all of this. So if you're setting meetings for the individual piece, set them for 15 minutes. Don't set them for an hour and a half. If you are meeting a very large group, set it for an hour and be very specific to the agenda so that you can get the information out there and allow people to be able to absorb it, and maybe the need for further follow-up will be lessened. But I have to say, time management is very important, and I don't advocate for 3-4 a.m. emails. It was just necessary for that first acute sort of start of the COVID piece. But I don't advocate that be continuing 7 days a week, 20 hours a day as leaders. And I think once the sort of curve, speaking of flattening curves, once the curve of anxiety is lowered, then that's the really great space as leaders to move your whatever strategic path is, move it forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. So some final thoughts here. Effective communication and organizational leadership are closely linked. I think we've done a good job today talking about how closely linked they are, and the need to be, again, available to the people that you're working with so that you can connect with them, build that trusting relationship. You should have a plan for how you want to communicate with your company. So, Stephanie's articulated very well here, just about how, she used MS Teams a lot, and now she's moving from email to, now she's going to experiment with doing some video messaging, particularly to students. That's great, right? You have to adapt how you deliver, and that tool of how you deliver your messaging changes based on the environment and the situation. And then last thing, building that trust is an important aspect of effective communication. I can't really emphasize that enough about, through that, listening, being authentic, being visible, it creates that trust. And then it's always important, but then particularly important in crisis when we're, things are coming at us, and we just, the known unknown, as we talked about earlier. So with that being said, I think we're turning it over to you as the audience to ask Stephanie and I a few questions.
Great, thank you so much for that. I have compiled some other questions just to the side here. So the first one is, are there any times when visibility becomes overexposed, especially with external communications? If so, what are some signs that leaders could look for that they are too visible?
Stephanie, do you want to take first? I'm happy to answer.
Well, maybe you can back it up with sort of your
theory,
your sort of theory on this. Correct me if I'm wrong, kind of deal. Yeah, the overexposure is always a risk too. So you don't want your staff and the groups that you lead go, oh, not again. So there is a little bit of knowing when. So it's about timing. That's why if you set it to once a week, which I've just done this once a week piece, and then look at a plan where you start saying, okay, now we're going to need to maybe move to every other week, and then maybe get it back to some normalcy of where it was once a month, those kinds of things. Because yes, you don't want to, you can overexpose yourself, and then you don't have the, you sort of diluted your messages to the point where people are like, yeah, delete, moving on. So it is a fine balance. And I think once the acute phase of anything it also means that not only is the acute phase of some kind of critical moment starting to go down, so should your communication.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. Stephanie talked about it from a pragmatic, and she did use the term plan. I was just going to say that, you know, it's not the only framework. It's the one I like to communicate with, but the SMART framework, you create that, you look at every situation and you look at what's happening. And then, you know, when COVID was at its quote unquote, you know, infancy in getting here, but it was at its most uncertain on its impact, I think a lot of communication was really effective. And then what you do is, as Stephanie articulated, where you start looking at the situation and can you move from meeting twice a week to moving once a week, going back to once a month. We just had the weekly meeting we were talking about in the KPU context with the department chairs. Everyone was thrilled to meet once a week. And then at the last meeting, there was some conversation as, could we go down to once every 2 weeks? Do we have, like, so even the going back to listening, sometimes you can just listen to your audience, right? You'll get that feedback that you don't need. And the other thing that generates it is, Stephanie may be able to give a pragmatic example, but when you look at it, if you're reading all the time and you're getting a lot of questions, that's a sign that you need to continue to be visible. But as the questions start fading away, that's probably a sign that the information gap you're trying to manage has been filled.
Definitely.
Great. Okay, next question is, we have a scenario. So if you have a team member come to you and they've had an issue about your direct leader, how would you approach your leader about this?
Can I just clarify to make sure I understood the question? So someone that's reporting to me has come to me to complain about my boss?
Yes.
Okay.
Like, how would you approach your boss about the issue at hand?
Stephanie, no, in all seriousness, I think this is where that building trust is really important. Let's talk about the positives of this situation. The fact that someone has felt comfortable enough to come to you to reveal their concerns shows about the trusting relationship you have with that individual, that they feel that they can confide in you in that way. So that's great. Now, the next phase, which is a bit of an unknown, is what type of relationship do you have with your boss? And so that relationship will probably dictate the approach. And so, not to overwhelm you with communication theory, but there's indirect communication and direct communication. Depending on the relationship and depending on the nature of the leader, would dictate how you would approach that. Maybe if you're indirect, you may give the situation some context and then maybe reveal that some people are concerned. But if you have a really trusting relationship and the person's really open to feedback, you can maybe be more direct and say, hey, I've heard from team members that this is concerning them and maybe we should address it. I think you have to make sure you take and listen and be authentic and take how you manage that depends on your relationship with the ultimate leader. Stephanie, do you have any?
I mean, I can't speak for all leaders, but for me, if there was feedback that would help me improve, I would want to hear it. There is that piece about, I don't know if you've read the Crucial Conversations book, but there is a way to give feedback to even your leaders that makes it in a format that's digestible and can be heard, especially if it's feedback that comes from a constructive point of view. I know that for those leaders that are not as approachable, perhaps this is a kind of a difficult situation. But I think what you would tell your colleague, you don't want to start that sort of backroom conversation about your bosses or your leaders, and you don't want to necessarily engage in that with anyone that you're working with. So it's about having a crucial conversation with the person you're hearing this from, in that why are they maybe addressing you and not the person that needs the constructive feedback, and vice versa. How then do you approach someone in your office? That is a whole other lunch and learn type presentation on how to deliver bad news. I think that's probably something that we need to keep in the parking lot, because that's a difficult thing to manage, especially if you have a boss that isn't necessarily open to hearing some constructive feedback.
And you have to make that, Sevi made a good point. You have to make that distinction between actual valuable constructive feedback and just, as she talked about, just someone being unhappy with the decision, kind of that gossip kind of feedback. So as Stephanie articulated, let's park it, lunch and learn.
Yes, that's a good
For
idea.
another occasion.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, next question. How do you reduce the misunderstanding caused by people that cannot communicate face-to-face?
This is why there's an entire discipline in applied communications, because it isn't easy. You know, I would love to say I'm here giving this presentation. I'd love to say I've never had a failed communication in my career. That would not be an accurate reflection. I think what it is you use these tools we've talked about. So talking in the context of today, the organizational communication, you use these tools to be more effective, to limit that breakdown in communication, and maybe manage it. But it's not 100%, it's not perfect. And the other thing that, again, is another lunch and learn, is sometimes you say something and sometimes people don't always hear what you're trying to say. Sometimes it's your delivery and sometimes it's how they've heard it. So that's managing. But again, that's why you try to use these frameworks to eliminate that interpretation error that occurs.
Okay.
If I can give some piece of advice for that, always clarify. When you have said something, whether it's an email, MS Teams, Zoom, telephone, ask somebody or ask that person to somehow come back and express to you their understanding of what you've just told them. So that you can clarify that person has definitely understood you, especially if you are delegating communication to others. So if as dean, I would be delegating that the associate deans would be communicating to the chairs or to the departments that they oversee. I need to know that they fully understand what I would like expressed. And so they clarify and make sure in their own words how they've understood what I've said. And then if there's any corrections to be made, I can correct that, and back and forth until I know that they fully understand, and then they can go and communicate on my behalf. So that is very much part of a communication plan and a leadership team that communicates well with each other.
Awesome. Okay, when you are working with an audience based off multiple ethnicities, how would you manage the potential issues caused by cultural differences?
I think that's a challenge for sure. I think when you talk about building that trust, building that being authentic, I think hopefully you've built that relationship and you continue to rely on your framework to deliver the message, and hopefully you've established an effective communication culture. And so when you talk about culture, you talk about common language or common heritage, but there's corporate culture as well. So hopefully through the effectiveness of your corporate culture, that your communication flow of information is effective and kind of eliminate some of those interpretation errors. Stephanie, any comments?
I think you have to be very careful in what you're saying. So for instance, from an intercultural point of view, you also have to think about gender. You have to think about positions in your workplace. You have to think about all sorts of things in any of the messages that you are putting out there. So my advice is that it is succinct, it is based in fact and evidence, it is compassionate because that is universal, and it avoid things such as certain forms of humor, sentences where you're trying to relate to your group. I wouldn't go that route because it can come off only from your particular perspective. Whereas, for me as a white woman, making some kind of joke that only other white women would understand is not an appropriate way to communicate as a leader. So just avoid those kinds of things. And then those messages then will be heard by everyone. And they won't have elements of sort of only that one particular cultural group would understand. So I think as leaders, when it comes to your communication, you have to know your own position. You have to know your own culture and where you stand, and you have to be aware of what you might be missing. So if you are from a particular area, that you have to understand that you may not understand other cultures, and you have to admit that. You have to bracket it, and you have to understand it. And you have to be very clear in your communication that you do have blind spots. All of us do. Everyone does. And so to be very aware of that and accepting of that, and just be ready to apologize if you happen to step into something without knowing. So it's a tough one. Again, that is a intercultural communication is a very important piece as a functioning, highly functioning leader. And maybe Darren and we can send you some resources to the Richmond Chamber for some extra reading on how to better communicate from a leader's point of view in that context. And at KPU, and Darren, you would agree, I mean, we've got all walks of life at a university, and our communication style is very different because of the context of a university. And I often have conversations with my husband, and his area is industrial. And he's often shocked at how we communicate, and vice versa. And I'm thinking, oh, we would never say that at a university. So there are ways and improvements in being able to speak from an intercultural point of view. And we can send the chamber some resources for you.
Great. I know we're just about at 1 o'clock, but I'd like to ask this last question quickly. Is delegating to an appropriate person to answer or give information also part of planning?
Oh.
Yeah, it can be, for sure. I think the nature of the situation that's created the need to communicate dictates who should be doing the communication. Like, for example, I don't think it would have been appropriate, and I think one of the reasons I admire Dr. Bonnie Henry's approach to the COVID situation is she was the one responsible. She didn't send a communications quote unquote expert out to deliver the message on her behalf, because that puts a great risk about the details, particularly the medical details, being delivered incorrectly by no intention, but just by lack of expertise. Where by her taking and being front and center, by being the chief medical officer for the province, I think it made good sense for her to take that on. What I would envision over time, she'll start delegating more as as COVID numbers continue and it's more managed, because it's not a crisis, it's a situation that's being managed. And I think so the timing of when you delegate, the situation dictates, and the timing dictates how you delegate. So you're nodding, Stephanie, so I think I got that one right.
Completely. That's why I was up at 4 a.m. doing messaging and wasn't delegating, because in that acute phase, it should come from the leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing that amazing information with us. We hope everyone has learned something today. Dr. Francis will be sending over his slides to me, and I'll be sending them to everyone later today. If you would like to watch this presentation again, providing we don't have any technical difficulties, it'll be posted on the Richmond Chamber website. Before we part for the day, I would like to let everyone know to keep checking in on our website for future events and webinars. Sounds like we might have gotten a couple ideas here today. Please reach out to myself or any of my colleagues if you have a suggested topic for these Lunch and Learns. Once again, thank you, Dr. Darren Francis and Stephanie House from KPU for joining us today, and we wish everyone the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Darren, for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for joining. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Shanna.
Thank you so much.